What would you do if the world you knew was taken from you, and all you were given in its place was a mockery? A piece of earth so barren it was meant only as an insult. This is the story of Catherine Bray, a quiet young woman in 1850s Somerset who, after the death of her father, was handed the worthless half of the family estate for the price of her own grief. But what her brothers saw as a pile of rocks, Catherine saw as her last connection to the man who had raised her, and the truth waiting inside a set of forgotten maps would rewrite not only her own future, but the very foundations of their family legacy. Settle in and let us know in the comments where, in the world you're watching from, as we journey back to the damp lanes and windswept hills of provincial England. The coach wheels churned mud, each rotation a slow, grinding turn of the screw tightening the knot of grief in Catherine Bray's chest. At 19, she felt older than the hedgerows that blurred past the window, ancient and tangled things heavy with rain. She had left Bray Manor 3 years prior to be a companion to an aging aunt, a duty expected and performed without complaint. Now, she was returning for a funeral, her father's. The house, when she finally saw it cresting the hill, seemed smaller, its proud stone face somehow shrunken and sad under the pewter sky. Her brothers Edward and Thomas met her not at the door but in the hall, their black coats already seeming tight with a new, unearned authority. Edward, the eldest, gave a curt nod. "Catherine, you're late. The reading is in an hour." There was no warmth, no shared sorrow. There was only business. The air in the solicitor's office in the village was thick with the scent of dry paper beeswax, and the unspoken resentments of a family gathering for the final time. Mr. Davies, a man whose face seemed made of the same parchment he handled, cleared his throat and began to read. The will was simple, brutal in its clarity. To Edward, the manor house, the home fields, the fat, fertile lowlands that were the heart of the Bray estate. To Thomas, the tenanted farms, the mill, the steady income that flowed from the labor of others. And to his daughter Catherine. Mr. Davies paused, his eyes flicking towards her with a flicker of pity. "To my only and beloved daughter Catherine," he read, "I leave the entirety of the West Tract, comprising some 200 acres of upland, its shepherd's hut, and all rights pertaining thereto. I also leave her my personal effects, including my books, my journals, and my surveying tools, in the hope that she may find in them some small comfort." A choked sound, half laugh, half scoff, came from Edward, the West Tract. It was a family joke, a wild, untamable expanse of gorse, granite, and wind. It was where the soil was too thin to plow and the sheep grew lean chasing sparse clumps of grass. It was worthless, an inheritance of stone and sky, given to the daughter who was owed a home. It was a dismissal, a final, patriarchal shove out of the warm center of the family and into the cold margins. Catherine felt the sting of it, the public humiliation, but her face remained a pale, still mask. She looked at her hands, clasped in her lap. They were her father's hands, long-fingered and capable. She remembered him taking her up to the West Tract as a girl, the wind whipping their hair. "This is the bones of the land, Kate," he'd said, his voice full of a strange reverence. "Everything else is just flesh." She rose from her chair. The solicitor looked up, surprised by her composure. "I accept my father's bequest," she said, her voice quiet but clear. The room was silent. Edward stared, his smirk faltering. He had expected tears, protests. He had not expected this quiet, unnerving dignity. Catherine gave a slight bow of her head to Mr. Davies and walked out, leaving her brothers to their spoils. She went not to the grand house, but to the small room above the stables where her father had kept his private world. It smelled of him, of oiled leather, old paper, and pipe smoke. In the corner sat his old lurcher, Ghost, a pale, silent creature who raised his head and thumped his tail once upon seeing her. She knelt and buried her face in his soft fur, and only then did the first hot tears begin to fall. The transfer of the deed was a cold formality. a scratch of pen on paper that legally severed Catherine from the life she had known. The West Tract was hers. The name itself felt like a judgment. Her portion was a geographical afterthought, a place defined only by its relation to the true center of things. In the days that followed the reading of the will, Bray Manor was a house of ghosts for Catherine. She moved through its familiar rooms like a stranger, gathering the few things that were truly hers. Her mother's sewing box, a handful of books, and the contents of her father's study. This last task she performed with a reverent slowness. His life was there in the margins of his books, in the worn handle of his walking stick, in the intricate, spidery lines of his maps. She packed them all into a heavy wooden chest, dozens of rolled parchments and linen-backed charts, each one a testament to the years he had spent walking and measuring every inch of his land. Especially, she noted, the West Tract. There were more maps of that barren upland than of all the fertile fields combined. Her brothers watched her preparations with a kind of detached amusement. "What will you do with all that old paper, sister?" Thomas asked one afternoon, finding her carefully tying a ribbon around a sheaf of geological surveys. "Paper the walls of your palace?" Catherine did not reply. She simply continued her work, her silence a more effective shield than any sharp retort. Her loyal old friend, a neighboring farmer named John, who had known her since she was a girl, arrived with his cart as promised. He was a man of few words and deep kindness. He loaded her trunk, the chest of maps, and a small collection of household goods without question or comment. As he helped her onto the seat, he pressed a small, cloth-wrapped bundle into her hand. "From my wife," he murmured. "Bread and cheese. The road is long." Edward appeared on the steps of the manor as they were about to leave, a glass of port in his hand. "A queen departing for her kingdom," he called out, his voice rich with condescension. "Do try not to get lost among your mountains, Catherine. We should hate to have to send a search party." Catherine looked at him, her gaze level. She saw not a brother, but a man made small by his own greed. She felt a profound and surprising pity for him. He had the house, the fields, the money, but he had not understood their father at all. She gave a slight nod to John, and the cart jolted forward, away from the manicured lawns and toward the wild, unknown country that was now hers. The dismissed object was not just the land. It was the collection of papers she carried with her. The maps and journals everyone else saw as a dead man's eccentric hobby. But as the cart rumbled on, Catherine held the conviction, fragile as a bird's egg, that her father had left her something more than rocks and wind. He had left her a language, the language of the land itself, and she was determined to learn how to read it. What does a person do when the world has written them off? Do they accept the judgment? Or do they search for a truth no one else has the patience to find? What secrets lay buried beneath that worthless soil, and what story did those old maps truly tell? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet strength and hidden discovery. Now, as Catherine's cart began its slow climb, the real journey was just beginning. The journey to the market town was a necessary ordeal. Catherine needed supplies that went beyond bread and cheese: an axe, a saw, nails, a lantern, oil, and enough flour and salt to last her through the initial weeks. John drove her in, tying his horse outside the corn exchange while Catherine moved through the familiar shops, now as an outsider. The faces that had known her since birth now regarded her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves. Poor thing, her own brothers. The West Tract? Might as well have given her the moon. Prideful, that one. Should have begged for a proper allowance. She paid them no mind, her focus entirely on the list she had made. She was methodical, her purchases practical and stark. No comforts, only necessities. As she was counting out her coins for a length of rope at the ironmonger's, a shadow fell over the counter. Well, well, the lady of the manor comes to town. It was Edward. He stood there, flanked by two of his sycophantic friends, his face flushed with midday wine. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking her exit. "Stocking your larder, Catherine. I trust you've purchased a good supply of stones for your soup." His friends snickered. The shopkeeper suddenly found something intensely interesting to polish under the counter. Catherine simply gathered her parcels, her face impassive. "Excuse me, Edward. I need to pass." "Oh, but I'm so enjoying the spectacle," he said, his voice loud enough for the whole market square to hear. The great Miss Bray, reduced to buying her own nails. "Tell me, what is it like to be the proud owner of nothing?" He gestured expansively at the distant, hazy outline of the hills. "Does your kingdom please you?" Catherine met his gaze, and for a moment the quiet girl was gone. In her place was a woman forged in fresh grief and old resilience. "It does," she said, her voice low, but carrying a strange weight. "More than you could ever understand." She made to step around him, but he shifted, still blocking her way. Just then, a stooped figure shuffled forward from the edge of the square. It was old Thomas, a man who had been a groundskeeper for her father for 50 years before his back gave out. He was ancient, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his hands permanently curled around the memory of a spade. He stopped beside Catherine, ignoring Edward completely. He looked up at the sky, then toward the west tract, as if judging the weather. He touched the brim of his worn cap, a gesture of respect aimed solely at her. "Your father," he said, his voice a dry rasp, "knew every stone on that land has a name." He said nothing more. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod and shuffled away, disappearing into the alley beside the baker's. The simple pronouncement, delivered with such solemnity, hung in the air. Edward's smirk faltered. The words were meaningless, and yet they felt like a judgment, a piece of lore to which he was not privy. The moment was broken. Deflated, he stepped aside with an irritated huff. Catherine walked past him without another glance, her parcels held tight. The villagers who had been watching fell silent. They had seen the squire's cruelty, but they had also seen the old man's reverence. They did not understand it, but they had seen it. And in a small provincial world, what is seen is what becomes true. The encounter left a mark, but not the one Edward had intended. His mockery had only served to harden her resolve, and the old man's words echoed in her mind, a strange and cryptic blessing. Every stone has a name. What could he have meant? The question followed her all the way out of town, a new mystery to add to the map of her future. The cart track that led to the west tract was less a road and more a rumor. It climbed steeply from the valley floor, a muddy scar winding through hawthorn and blackthorn, the ruts so deep that the axle of John's cart groaned in protest. Ghost, her father's lurcher, trotted silently alongside, his lean form a study in pale efficiency. As they ascended, the character of the land changed. The lush green of the lowlands gave way to tougher grasses, heather, and the stark gray shoulders of granite breaking through the thin soil. The air grew colder, cleaner, scented with damp earth and the wild, peppery smell of gorse. John pulled the horse to a stop at a dilapidated gate hanging from a single hinge. "This is it," he said, his voice subdued. The boundary. Beyond the gate lay Catherine's inheritance. It was exactly as bleak as its reputation suggested. A rolling, desolate expanse under a vast and indifferent sky. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip, casting long, skeletal shadows from the few stunted trees that clung to life in the sheltered dips of the terrain. A raw wind swept down from the high tors, a constant, sighing presence that promised a harsh and lonely existence. They followed the track for another half-mile until they saw it, the shepherd's hut. It was a small, grim structure of dry stone walls and a sagging slate roof, hunkered down against a rocky outcrop as if for protection. One of the walls had partially collapsed, and the single window was a dark, vacant eye. Disappointment, cold and sharp, pierced through Catherine's stoicism. She had known it would be primitive, but this was a ruin. John brought the cart to a halt and looked from the hut to Catherine's face, his own etched with concern. "It's in a sorry state, miss," he said quietly. "You cannot stay here." "I must," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. She slid down from the cart, her boots sinking into the wet ground. "It is my home now." Together they unloaded her meager possessions, piling them onto a patch of relatively dry ground. John, with his practical farmer's eye, immediately set to work, using stones from the collapsed wall to patch the worst of the hole. Catherine, meanwhile, pushed open the rotted plank door. The interior was a single small room, dark and smelling of damp, sheep, and decay. A stone hearth stood against one wall, choked with old ash and debris. The floor was packed earth, and in one corner a pile of moldering straw marked a shepherd's last bed. It was a place of profound and utter neglect, yet, as she stood there in the gloom, a strange feeling began to settle over her. This was hers. No one could take it from her. Its failings were her challenges, its potential her secret. While John finished his rough masonry, Catherine used the last of the daylight to gather fallen branches for a fire. By the time darkness fell, they had a small, sputtering flame in the hearth, pushing back the damp and casting flickering shadows on the stone walls. John shared his wife's bread and cheese with her, and the simple meal felt like a sacrament. He would not leave her to spend the first night alone, though he said nothing of it. He unrolled a blanket for himself by the fire, while Catherine made a bed for herself and Ghost from the cleaner straw she had brought. Lying there in the dark, listening to the wind howl around the corners of the hut like a hungry animal, the full weight of her decision pressed down on her. The warmth of Bray Manor, the company of others, the certainty of a roof that did not leak, all gone. She was an island, a solitary soul on a sea of rock and wind. Ghost shifted beside her, pressing his warm body against her back. She rested a hand on him, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. The wind cried, the fire popped, and the ancient stones of the hut seemed to sigh around her. She was terrified, and yet she was home. The thought did not bring comfort, not yet, but it brought a sense of rightness, a quiet click of a key turning in a lock. She had made her first contact with the raw material of her new life. The first week was a battle for survival. Each day, Catherine rose at dawn, her body aching from the cold and the hard floor, and set to work. The priority was shelter. With the axe and saw, she cut rough timbers from a small, neglected copse of birch in a nearby hollow, using them to brace the sagging roof. She learned the art of mixing clay and straw to daub the gaps in the stone walls, her hands becoming chapped and raw. She cleared the chimney, swept the floor, and used old sacking to cover the empty window frame, creating a dim but weatherproof sanctuary. Ghost was her constant, silent shadow, watching her labor with his wise, amber eyes, offering his quiet presence as his only and most essential contribution. During this time, she explored her domain. She walked the boundaries her father's will had described, her boots tracing a 200-acre perimeter of stone walls and lonely marker posts. The land was hard, unforgiving, but it was not without its own stark beauty. She discovered hidden springs bubbling up clear and cold from fissures in the rock, patches of wild thyme that released their scent when she crushed them underfoot, and the soaring, effortless flight of a kestrel hunting on the wind. She felt her father's presence here more strongly than she ever had in the grand house below. She could almost see him striding over the tors, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his mind charting the secrets of the earth. One evening, exhausted from a day of hauling stone, she finally allowed herself to open the heavy chest of maps. She needed to feel that connection, to see the land not through her own tired eyes, but through his. By the light of her single tallow candle, she unrolled the first large parchment. It was a topographical survey of the entire West Tract, rendered in exquisite detail with black and brown inks. Every contour, every outcrop, every stream was marked with his neat, precise hand. Her finger traced the lines, matching them to the landscape she was coming to know so intimately. The hut was there, marked as Shepherd's Rest, the birch copse, the spring, all present. But then her eye snagged on a detail in the northern quadrant of the property. It was a small, elegant cross, and beside it, the words King's Stone. She stared at the mark. She had walked that very area 2 days before. She remembered it clearly. A wide, unusually flat clearing, choked with a thick, thorny mat of brambles and gorse, with a jumble of fallen rocks at its eastern edge. There had been no great stone, no monolith, no landmark worthy of such a name. There was nothing there at all. She pulled out another, older map, this one a geological survey from 20 years prior. There it was again, King's Stone. It was marked as a significant feature, a point from which other measurements were taken. It was foundational to the geography of the entire tract. A third map, a simple sketch of water sources, showed the stone as a watershed directing the flow of runoff. It was impossible. A stone that large, a landmark so significant, could not simply vanish. It could be buried, perhaps, or broken up for walling, but the maps depicted it with a certainty that defied its absence. Catherine sat back, the candle flame dancing in the draught. The silence of the hut pressed in on her. Everyone had told her this land was worthless. Her brothers, the villagers, her own eyes on that first day. But the maps, her father's silent voice, told a different story. They spoke of a landmark that was not there, a place of importance that had been erased, a small detail, a single inconsistency, but it refused to fit. It was the first loose thread in a tapestry of neglect, and Catherine, with nothing else to hold on to, felt an irresistible urge to pull it. The decision was made not in a moment of grand revelation, but in the quiet resolve of the following morning. The mystery of the King's Stone had taken root in her mind. It was a purpose, a focal point in the vast, overwhelming task of taming her inheritance. For now, the larger project of farming could wait. First, she would solve her father's riddle. She put aside the repairs on the hut, judging it secure enough for the time being. Her new focus was the flat clearing a half-mile to the north. She packed a small bag with bread, a flask of water from the spring, and her sturdiest tools, a heavy billhook, a spade, and a pair of thick leather gloves her father had once used for clearing scrub. Ghost trotted ahead, his nose to the ground, as if he, too, sensed a change in their daily rhythm. The clearing was just as she remembered it, an ugly tangle of thorns and bracken nearly as tall as she was. It looked impenetrable, a task for a team of men, not a lone woman with hand tools. For a moment her resolve wavered. The scale of it was daunting. But then she looked at her father's map, which she had brought with her, its corner weighted down with a stone. The cross was unambiguous. Whatever was here, her father had deemed it important. She took a deep breath, pulled on her gloves, and began to work. The labor was brutal. The brambles were thick as a man's thumb, armed with vicious thorns that tore at her clothes and skin despite the gloves. She swung the billhook in a steady, rhythmic arc, clearing a small patch at the edge and then working her way inward. Sweat stung her eyes, and her back and shoulders screamed in protest. Every few hours she would stop, drink some water, and share a piece of her bread with Ghost, who lay patiently in the shade of a rowan tree, his head on his paws, watching her toil. Days passed in this manner. The sun rose, she worked. The sun set, she trudged back to the hut, her muscles trembling with fatigue, to fall into a heavy, dreamless sleep. A week turned into 2. The pile of cleared brush grew into a small mountain, and slowly, painstakingly, the ground began to reveal itself. It was, as she had first noted, naturally flat. As she cleared the final layers of roots and undergrowth from the center of the area, her spade struck something that was not earth or root. It made a dull, solid clink, not the sharp crack of striking a random rock, but a deeper, more resonant sound. Her heart quickened. She knelt, digging carefully around the point of impact with her hands. She scraped away the thin layer of topsoil and turf, and her fingers brushed against something cool, flat, and unmistakably man-made. It was stone. Yes, but it was dressed stone, smooth-sided. She kept digging, her initial caution giving way to a frantic energy. The stone was not a single piece, but one of a series. They were set together with incredible precision, forming a perfect, straight line. She scrambled back, her eyes wide, and began to clear the soil from a larger area. The pattern emerged from the earth like a developing photograph. A line of stones became a corner. The corner became a rectangle. It was a cap, a lid, a series of massive dressed stones, each several feet long, fitted together to cover something buried beneath. It was not a standing stone at all. The king's stone was not a landmark you looked up at. It was something you stood upon. Her father hadn't marked a feature of the landscape. He had marked a feature hidden within it. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. She sat back on her heels, breathing heavily, her hands covered in dirt. The clearing was silent save for the ever-present wind. The sun was low in the sky, casting a golden light over her work. She had not found what she was looking for. She had found something infinitely more important. The next 2 days were a fever of focused effort. The capstones were immense, far too heavy for one person to lift. Catherine, however, had spent her life observing the practical mechanics of the farm. She had seen men move hayricks and shift fallen trees using little more than leverage and ingenuity. She fetched her longest timber beam and a collection of smaller, sturdy rocks to use as fulcrums. Positioning the beam into a tiny gap between 2 of the capstones, she threw her entire weight against it. The timber groaned. The stone did not move. She tried again, adjusting the fulcrum. Nothing. Exhausted and frustrated, she sat down, staring at the intractable stone. Ghost padded over and rested his head on her knee, whining softly. It was then she noticed it, a small, drilled hole in the corner of one of the central stones, almost completely filled with dirt and moss. It was an access point, a place to insert a tool. Using the point of her spade, she meticulously cleaned it out. It was deep and perfectly round. It was a purchase point. With renewed hope, she found a narrow iron stake among her tools and hammered it into the hole. Using the stake as a new anchor for her lever, she tried again. This time, with a deep grating screech of stone on stone, the capstone shifted. An inch, it was enough. For the rest of the day, she worked with a primal, desperate strength, inching the massive stone sideways until a dark gap was revealed. The air that rose from the opening was cold and ancient, smelling of deep earth and stillness. It was a tomb-like darkness, absolute and profound. She had no idea what lay within. Fearing animals or a deep drop, she tied her lantern to a length of rope and slowly lowered it into the void. The circle of light descended, illuminating rough-hewn stone walls. It was a small, dry chamber, no more than 6 feet deep, and resting in the center of the floor, squat and immovable, was a heavy, iron-strapped strongbox. Her breath caught in her throat. It was real. All of it. The cryptic maps, the back-breaking labor, the impossible hope. It had all led to this. Getting the box out was another monumental task, requiring a ramp of timbers and all the rope she possessed. It took the better part of a day to haul it, scraping and groaning, up into the light. It was made of dark, heavy oak, bound with thick iron straps, and secured with a large, complex lock. There was no key. For a moment, despair threatened. Had she come all this way only to be thwarted by a piece of metal? She refused to accept it. She would break it open if she had to. But her father's voice echoed in her memory. A man of precision, not brute force. She raced back to the hut, her mind churning, the maps, the journals. It had to be there. She tore open the chest of papers, her hands shaking. Tucked into the back of one of her father's leather-bound journals, she found a small, folded note she had previously overlooked. Inside was not a key, but a riddle. Where sight ends, touch begins, she thought of the map chest itself. It was plain, functional. She ran her hands over the smooth wood of the lid, the sides. Nothing. Then, inside, she felt along the bottom, beneath the stacked journals. Her fingers brushed against a false panel. With a click, it sprang open, revealing a hidden compartment. And nestled inside on a bed of faded velvet lay a single, heavy, ornate iron key. She snatched it up and ran back to the clearing, her heart pounding against her ribs. The key slid into the lock. It turned with a well-oiled, satisfying clunk. With trembling hands, Catherine lifted the heavy lid. There was no glint of gold, no sparkle of jewels. The box was filled with papers, bundled and tied with faded ribbon. On top lay a single, thick envelope, sealed with her great-grandfather's wax signet. Addressed not to an heir, but to my dearest Eleanor, a letter. Beneath it were deeds, brittle with age, and at the very bottom, a formal legal testament wrapped in oilskin. She picked up the letter, her hands trembling as she broke the seal. The ink was faded, but the script was clear. "My love," it began, "you worry for the children, that the division of the estate will breed resentment. Fear not. I have purchased the West Tract first and foremost. It is the true seat of our family, the rock upon which all else is built. The lowlands are a later acquisition, a lease from the crown, conditional upon the good stewardship of the whole. I have lodged the original title with this letter in the earth of the land itself. For only one who loves the bones of this place enough to find it will be worthy of its heart." Catherine sank to her knees, the letter shaking in her hand. It wasn't an inheritance, it was a test of character, set in motion 100 years ago, and her father, by leaving her the maps, had given her the chance to pass it. She looked at the deeds. The original title for the entire Bray estate was vested not in the manor, but in the rocky, barren, worthless 200 acres of the West Tract. The discovery left Catherine in a daze. She sat by the open strongbox, the ancient papers spread before her, and tried to absorb the magnitude of what she had found. The wind, which had been her constant tormentor, now seemed to whisper a song of vindication. That night she barely slept. The papers lay on the small table in her hut, a silent, powerful testament to a truth long buried. She was not the disinherited daughter. She was the keeper of the estate's origin, the true heir to its foundational legacy. But with this knowledge came a new and daunting uncertainty. What was she to do with it? The thought of confronting her brothers, of the legal battles and the public spectacle, was deeply unsettling. For a few days she did nothing, simply living with her secret. And then the weather turned. The sky, which had been a clear, crisp autumn blue, grew heavy and bruised. The wind lost its sighing quality and began to snarl. A great storm brewed in the distant sea was rolling in across the Somerset levels, and the West Tract stood directly in its path. Catherine worked frantically to prepare, securing the roof timbers, banking earth against the north wall of the hut, and bringing in enough firewood to last for days. The first rains came at dusk, not as a shower but as a solid wall of water. The wind hit with the force of a physical blow, screaming over the tors. The little hut, her hard-won sanctuary, shuddered under the assault. Rain found its way through a dozen tiny gaps she had missed, and the single room grew cold and damp. Ghost pressed against her, trembling. Through the roar of the wind, she heard a new sound, a desperate shouting. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw a lantern swinging wildly in the deluge. A man was struggling with a broken cart, its wheels shattered in a deep rut on the track. Beside him, a woman huddled, clutching a small child. They were travelers, caught on the high ground in the teeth of the gale. Without a second thought, Catherine threw open the door, the wind tearing it from her grasp. "Here," she yelled, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "Shelter, here," she helped the man, whose name was Daniel, lead his terrified wife, Mary, and their little boy into the hut. Mary was pale and shivering, her pregnancy making her movements slow and weary. Catherine sat them by the fire, wrapping them in her own dry blankets and pressing a hot cup of brewed thyme tea into their hands. For 3 days the storm raged. The four of them were prisoners in the tiny stone room, sharing Catherine's meager food and the warmth of the small fire. Daniel, a carpenter by trade, was amazed by her handiwork on the hut. "You did this yourself?" he asked, running a hand over the newly daubed walls. "It's a strong little place. You've given it good bones." Mary, quiet and watchful, saw the strain on Catherine's face, the way she carefully rationed their food. On the second night, as the storm reached its peak, Mary's hand found Catherine's in the firelight. "You have a good heart, miss," she whispered, "to take in strangers when you have so little." In that moment, sheltering this family on her land, protecting them from the very elements that had defined her hardship, something shifted in Catherine. The papers in the strong box were about legal rights and ownership. But this was about stewardship. This was about creating a place of refuge where before there had been only neglect. The storm was not a crisis. It was a crucible. It burned away her fear and hesitation. She was not just fighting for her inheritance. She was fighting for the future of this land and for the right to make it a sanctuary. When the storm finally broke on the fourth morning, leaving a washed, glittering world in its wake, she knew what she had to do. As Daniel repaired his cartwheel using tools and timber Catherine provided, he looked at her with a new respect. "If you ever need a carpenter's hand, miss," he said, his voice sincere, "you have only to ask." The family departed with profound thanks, their gratitude a quiet blessing on the little hut. Their departure marked a turning point. Catherine packed the most important documents, the letter, the original deed, and the testament, into a waterproof oilskin pouch. She dressed in her cleanest, most respectable clothes, which now seemed foreign and ill-fitting after weeks of manual labor. With a final look at the quiet strength of her small home, she and Ghost began the long walk down from the hills. The journey to the county town of Taunton took the better part of the day. When she arrived at the offices of Davies and Finch, she was a stark contrast to the woman who had left there weeks ago. Her face was weathered by sun and wind, her hands were the hands of a laborer, and her eyes held a new, unshakable calm. Mr. Davies received her in the same dusty office, his expression one of polite, professional sympathy for the poor, disinherited girl. "Miss Bray," he said, gesturing to a chair, "how may I be of service? Have you reconsidered your position?" "I have not," Catherine replied, her voice even. She untied the pouch and laid the ancient, brittle documents on his polished desk. "I believe you will want to see these." The solicitor picked up the great-grandfather's letter with a sigh, his manner suggesting he was humoring a distressed client. He began to read. His expression shifted from indulgence to mild interest, then to sharp, focused attention. He put the letter down and reached for the deed, his movements now brisk and precise. He held it up to the light, examining the paper, the ink, the seals. He spread the legal testament on his desk, his finger tracing the archaic legal phrasing. For a long time, the only sound in the room was the rustle of dry parchment and the ticking of the tall case clock in the corner. Mr. Davies looked up, his professional mask gone. In its place was sheer, unadulterated astonishment. "In all my years," he murmured, almost to himself, "in all my years, I have never seen the like." He looked at Catherine, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw not a foolish girl, but the agent of a century-old plan. "These are genuine," he said, his voice hushed with awe. "The seals are correct. The provenance is unimpeachable. Miss Bray, do you understand what this means?" "I believe so," Catherine said quietly. "It means the West Tract is the primary holding, and the lowlands are conditional upon it." "Comminational is a mild word," Mr. Davies corrected, his legal mind now racing. "The lease your great-grandfather secured from the Crown was dependent on the maintenance of the entire estate, including all markers and boundaries. The King's Stone, which your brother's own surveyors declared lost 10 years ago, was a key boundary marker. By allowing it to fall into ruin and be forgotten, and by failing to maintain the West Tract, they have been in breach of the lease for years. Their claim to the lowlands is forfeit. He summoned her brothers the following week. It was not a public confrontation, but a quiet, devastating meeting in the solicitor's office. Edward and Thomas arrived, confident and dismissive, expecting to deal with their sister's latest folly. They were met with the calm, irrefutable evidence of the past. Mr. Davies explained the legal position with dispassionate clarity. Edward blustered, then paled. Thomas simply stared at the documents, his face ashen. They were not ruined, not cast out as they had cast out their sister. But they were humbled. The power had shifted, silently and absolutely. News, in a small community, travels not like a flood, but like water seeping into soil. There was no grand announcement, but the story emerged in whispers and fragments. The laughter that had followed Catherine turned to murmurs of wonder, then respect. She had not found gold. She had found something far more valuable, the truth. The following spring, the West Tract was transformed. The raw, windswept upland was now a place of purpose. The shepherd's hut had been expanded, its stone walls now the heart of a proper, sturdy cottage with glazed windows and a roof that did not leak. A new barn was rising nearby, its timbers smelling sweetly of fresh-cut pine. The work was not done by Catherine alone. John, her loyal friend, was a constant presence, offering his strength and expertise. And one day, Daniel the carpenter had returned with his wife Mary and their newborn child, true to his word, to offer his skilled hands in gratitude. The villagers, who once pitied or mocked her, now made the journey up the track, not to stare, but to offer help. A sack of seed potatoes from one, a laying hen from another. They saw in Catherine not a vanquished girl, but a founder. She had taken the most despised piece of their landscape and made it a symbol of resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a long, golden light across the hills, Catherine stood with John on the rise overlooking her small, burgeoning settlement. Ghost, now graying around the muzzle but as devoted as ever, sat at her feet. Below them, the cottage glowed with warm lamplight, and the frame of the new barn stood stark and hopeful against the twilight sky. The air was still, fragrant with the smell of damp earth and wood smoke. It was a scene of profound and hard-won peace. "Your father would be proud, Catherine," John said, breaking the comfortable silence. "He always said this land had a good heart, if only someone had the patience to listen to it." Catherine looked out over the rolling hills, the land she now knew as intimately as her own hands. She thought of her brothers, now tenants on the land they had once owned, humbled but not broken. She thought of the journey she had taken, from a grief-stricken girl in a solicitor's office to the steward of this place. She reached into her pocket, and her fingers found the smooth, worn leather of her father's journal, which she now carried everywhere. She thought of the maps, the stones, the letter in the dark. John looked at her, waiting for a reply. She smiled, a small, quiet expression of pure contentment. "He didn't leave me land," she said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of a truth discovered. "He left me the truth." And in that simple statement lay the entirety of her inheritance. A legacy not of acres and deeds, but of character, patience, and the quiet triumph of seeing value where the rest of the world saw only waste. Thank you for joining us for this story of quiet strength and hidden legacies. If you were moved by Catherine's journey, please consider leaving a like and a comment below, and subscribe for more tales of history, hardship, and hope. We'll see you next time.